My father laid the foundation of everything we had with a borrowed transit level and 30 years of 6 a.m. mornings. My stepmother started liquidating it before his obituary ran in the Edmonton Journal. My name is Owen Calloway. I'm 41 years old. I live in St. Albert, Alberta, about 20 minutes north of the city, in the same neighborhood where I grew up watching my father leave the driveway before the sun came up. I work in commercial real estate development now, which means I spend my days reading blueprints and negotiating lease terms and understanding, in a way most people never have to, exactly what a business is actually worth and what it isn't. That education saved me. My father's foresight saved me more. His name was Leonard Calloway, Len to everyone who knew him. He started Calloway Mechanical Services Limited in 1991 out of a rented bay in Sherwood Park with a second-hand service van, a commercial HVAC certification he had studied for at night while working days as a journeyman pipe fitter, and a handshake reputation he spent the next 30 years making sure he never had to rebuild. By the time I was born in 1983, the company had 7 employees. By the time I was finishing my degree in business administration at the University of Alberta in 2006, Calloway Mechanical had 3 service bays in the industrial district east of the city, a fleet of 12 vehicles, maintenance contracts with commercial property managers across the Edmonton Metro, and a steady workforce of just over 90 people. They did HVAC installation, refrigeration systems, industrial ventilation, and preventive maintenance contracts with building owners who learned quickly that Len Calloway did not cut corners and did not send you an invoice for work that wasn't done. My father was not a complicated man to understand if you paid attention. He drove a 2009 Dodge Ram 1500 until the frame rusted through. He wore steel-toed Blundstones to industry dinners because he said a man who changes his shoes for a room hasn't earned the room. Every Friday morning for as long as I can remember, he ate breakfast at a diner called Donna's on 50th Street. 2 eggs over easy, rye toast, black tea, and he sat at the same table by the window and read the Edmonton Journal in print because he said screens gave him a headache before noon. He shook hands slowly and made eye contact like he was measuring something. He was. My mother, Patricia Calloway, died of ovarian cancer in February 2009. I was 25. My father was 57. The grief he carried was not the loud kind. It was structural. You could see it in the way he filled doorways when he didn't think anyone was watching, just standing, holding still, as though he needed a moment to remember what direction he was going. He never said much about it directly. He was from a generation of men who treated their own pain like a worksite injury. You wrapped it, you kept moving, and you didn't complain where the crew could hear you. He met Vivian Arkand in the spring of 2013. She was 44 years old at the time. My father was 61. She had worked for a decade as a leasing coordinator for a commercial property management firm in downtown Edmonton, which meant she understood contracts, she understood asset valuations, and she understood better than most people what a business with 90 employees and long-term service contracts was actually worth. My father thought this made them compatible. He was right, just not in the way he intended. Vivian was composed in a way I found difficult to name at first. She was warm when it served her, and professional when warmth would have cost her something. Around my father she was attentive, interested, present. Around me she was cordial in the way a good hotel is cordial, pleasant, efficient, and entirely indifferent to who you actually are. She never said anything overtly hostile. She never gave me a reason I could point to. It was more like being the tenant in a building where the new property manager has different priorities and is waiting for your lease to expire. My father and Vivian married in September 2015. She moved into the house in Glenora where I had grown up. I was 32 years old, had my own place in St. Albert, and was doing my best to be a reasonable adult about the whole thing. I came for Sunday dinners. I was polite. I kept my observations to myself. By 2020, Vivian had positioned herself inside Calloway Mechanical in a way that had happened gradually enough that nobody could point to the exact moment it began. She had no background in mechanical contracting, no technical certifications, nothing that would have gotten her an interview if she had walked in off the street. But she was the owner's wife, and my father trusted her, and so she had become what the company's internal documents described as office and accounts manager. She handled the company credit card reconciliations. She reviewed vendor invoices before they went to the bookkeeper. She managed the payroll administration for the administrative staff. She had a salary that my father had set and apparently never questioned. She had a company fuel card. She had signing authority on the operating account up to $5,000 per transaction. I noticed things, specific things. A heating equipment supplier invoice in the fall of 2021 that was 30% higher than the quote on file. A vendor name in the accounts payable ledger I had never heard mentioned on any job I had been involved with. A fuel card statement with fill-ups at locations nowhere near any active job site. I raised it with my father in December 2021. We were sitting in his kitchen after dinner. Vivienne was at her sister's place in Spruce Grove, and I laid it out the way I would have laid out a discrepancy to a site foreman, professionally, specifically, without accusation. He looked at the papers I had printed. He was quiet for a long time. Then he looked up and said, "Owen, I'm 69 years old. I've spent 40 years building something. I'm not going to spend whatever's left tearing apart my own house to find something I might have wrong." I went home. I should have pushed harder. I didn't. My father had a stroke in January 2023. It was minor, as strokes go. No lasting paralysis, no significant speech impairment. But his cardiologist at the University of Alberta Hospital was direct with him. The vascular damage was cumulative. He needed to slow down in a way he had never slowed down before. He was not a man who knew how to do that gracefully, but he tried. He handed more of the day-to-day operations to his operations manager, a 50-year-old man named Boyd Strickland, who had been with Callaway Mechanical for 14 years and ran job sites with the kind of quiet authority that crews respect immediately. He came into the office less. He went to Donna's for breakfast more. He died on a Thursday morning in October 2024. He was 72 years old. He died at home in Glenora, in the room where he had slept for 30 years with Vivienne beside him. My phone rang at 7:14 in the morning. I drove from St. Albert to Glenora, in conditions I should not have been driving in, which will tell you something about my state of mind. He looked like himself. That is the only way I know how to describe it. Whatever argument a person makes about where people go, my father looked like a man who had simply stopped, the way a machine stops when the job is done. I stood in that room for a long time. Vivienne was in the kitchen. I could hear her on the phone, her voice low and organized, managing things. I filed that away and told myself I was reading into it because I was in grief, and grief makes you suspicious. I was wrong to second-guess myself. The service was held the following Wednesday at a funeral home in the West End. Mechanical contractors, property managers, city inspectors, former apprentices who were now running their own crews. The room held more people than the chairs. Men who had worked job sites with my father in the 90s stood next to building owners who had signed with Callaway Mechanical, because Len Calloway had personally returned a call on a statutory holiday. Vivienne sat in the front row in a black blazer and pearl earrings, and received condolences with gracious efficiency. 46 hours after my father's funeral, I received a letter by registered mail. The return address was a family law and estates firm in downtown Edmonton, a practice called Hartwell Desrosiers LLP. The letter was from a partner named Frank Desrosiers, advising me that he was acting on behalf of Vivienne Calloway and that pursuant to my father's most recently executed will, dated August 2024, 2 months before he died, Vivienne Calloway was the sole beneficiary of his estate, including the family residence in Glenora, all personal financial accounts, and 100% of the shares in Callaway Mechanical Services Limited. The letter suggested, in the precise and impersonal language that lawyers are trained to use when they want to deliver a blow while maintaining plausible civility, that I contact Mr. Desrosiers' office at my earliest convenience to discuss the retrieval of any personal items I might wish to collect from the family home. I read that letter at my kitchen table in St. Albert. I read it 3 times. There was a moment, about 45 seconds, where something hot and jagged moved through my chest, and I understood what rage feels like when it has nowhere to go. And then it passed. What replaced it was something I recognized from a decade of commercial negotiations. The cold, deliberate focus that arrives when the situation is serious enough that you cannot afford to react. Something else was present in that cold clarity, a memory, a conversation. My father had called me on a Sunday afternoon in November 2023. He had been walking more slowly by then, taking his time on the front steps, watching the snow come down over the river valley. He said he wanted to have a cup of coffee. He came to my place in St. Albert, and we sat at my kitchen table for 2 hours. He asked me questions about Alberta corporate law. He asked me about the difference between a holding company and an operating company. He asked me what happened to a business's active contracts and equipment when its ownership structure changed. He was not a man who asked questions he didn't already have reason to ask. At the time, I had answered him and thought he was doing long-term succession planning, I had not understood that the succession had already begun. I called my lawyer the next morning. Her name is Sandra Poirier. She is 53 years old, a business and estates litigation lawyer based in downtown Edmonton with 25 years of practice and a reputation in Alberta commercial law that people in the industry mention without being asked. Sandra had acted for my father on corporate matters for over a decade. She picked up before the second ring. Owen, I've been expecting this call. You know about the August will? Come to the office this morning. There are things I need to show you that I can't explain over the phone. I was in her office on Jasper Avenue by 9 o'clock. She had a file on her desk that was thicker than I expected. Your father came to see me in September 2023, she said. He was methodical. He brought documentation, specific transactions in the company accounts that he had been tracking quietly for months. He didn't have enough for a legal action against anyone, but he had enough to know that something was wrong and that he needed to protect the business before it got worse. He came to you before he came to me. He didn't want to alarm you. He also didn't want to be wrong in front of you. What my father had done in the 6 weeks between that September meeting and the end of October 2023, with Sandra's guidance and the assistance of an Alberta corporate lawyer named Paul Whitmore, who specializes in business succession structuring, was this. He had legally and completely reorganized the ownership of Calloway Mechanical Services Limited. He had converted his sole ownership stake into a structure involving a family trust, the Leonard Calloway Family Trust, and a separate numbered holding company registered under Alberta's Business Corporations Act. The trust had a designated trustee. The trustee was Sandra Poirier. The successor beneficiary for operational control of all business assets was Owen Leonard Calloway. Me. The August 2024 will that Vivienne's attorney was presenting was real. It had been drafted and executed by my father, and it was a valid will under Alberta law. It left Vivienne the Glenora house, the personal financial accounts, and 100% of the shares in Calloway Mechanical Services Limited. What it did not account for, what Vivienne and Frank Desrosiers apparently did not know, was that Calloway Mechanical Services Limited, as of October 31, 2023, held no assets of any kind, no service vehicles, no tools or equipment, no active maintenance contracts, no trade receivables, no leases, no employees, no goodwill, no certifications, no operating accounts. Everything of actual value, the 12-vehicle fleet, the 3 service bays, the long-term maintenance contracts with commercial property managers, the equipment inventory, the company's HVAC and refrigeration licenses, the operational bank accounts, the trained workforce of 90 people, had been legally transferred into the holding company under the trust 11 months before my father wrote the will that left Sandra the company. The shares Vivienne was inheriting were shares in a dormant numbered shelf entity with 0 assets, 0 liabilities, and 0 operations. She was inheriting a corporate registration number and a name that no longer meant anything attached to it. I want to pause here because I need to say something true about the weeks between the funeral and the hearing. Grief is not dramatic. It doesn't announce itself and then wait politely for you to finish your other business. It shows up at 6 in the morning when you reach for your phone to send your father a text about something you saw on the drive-in. It shows up when you pull into the parking lot at a job site and realize there's no one you want to call first. It was present through all of it. Through the meetings with Sandra, through the documents, through the strategy. Grief and clarity are not opposites. They coexist in the same body at the same time, and they don't get in each other's way as much as people tell you they will. What clarity told me, standing in that particular November light that Alberta does in November, gray and flat and cold and honest, was that my father had done the work. He had seen what I had seen. He had been more patient about it than I had the temperament for, and more thorough, and he had built something I could stand on. Sandra's recommendation, delivered across her desk with the calm of someone who has spent 25 years in rooms where the outcome mattered, was this. Do not contest the will. Do not challenge the asset transfer. Do not file anything that looks like a fight. Give Vivienne exactly what the August will says. I sat with that. All of it? All of it. The house, the accounts, the company shares. We transfer everything the will specifies, cleanly and without opposition. I looked at her, and then Frank Desrosiers opens the corporate books. She didn't smile exactly. It was more of a considered pause, the expression of someone who has run every scenario and found only one of them interesting. I drove actually, it's Alberta, you drive. I drove back to St. Albert that evening and I sat on the back deck with a kokanee and watched the temperature drop. In Edmonton in November, the cold arrives without negotiation. The sky goes the color of old concrete, and then the stars come out and it's beautiful the way only cold places are beautiful, without any softening of the truth. I thought about my father eating rye toast at Donna's on a Friday morning, reading a paper that nobody else his age still read, trusting something as simple as a pattern of numbers that didn't add up. He had trusted his instincts all the way to the end. "I've got it from here," I said out loud to no one in particular. Vivian texted me 4 days after the funeral. 4 days, which I note because she had never texted me anything more personal than a notification that she would be late for Sunday dinner. The text said, "Owen, I hope we can handle this with dignity. Frank will reach out to Sandra this week." I read it twice. Then I made dinner. Pierogies from scratch, the kind my father used to make badly, and with enormous self-satisfaction on Saturday nights when there was nothing else going on. I had learned his recipe, which mostly involved too much butter and complete indifference to presentation. I hadn't been able to stop making them since he died. Frank Desrosiers contacted Sandra by email on a Thursday 10 days after the funeral. Sandra called me with a summary that evening. Frank had laid out Vivian's position in the manner of a man who had prepared for a substantial fight and wanted to establish terms before it began. The August 2024 will was valid. The estate was to be transferred in full and without delay. Any attempt to introduce alternative corporate structures or challenge the will's validity would be met with litigation. Frank used the phrase full enforcement of Alberta's spousal entitlements. He was specific and he was not bluffing, which I respected actually, because it meant he was serious, and serious people make better opponents. Sandra's response was simple. Owen Calloway did not intend to contest the will. He agreed with the transfer as documented. Sandra would prepare the paperwork for a full transfer of the Calloway Mechanical Services Limited shares to Vivian Calloway as the August will specified, and they could proceed at Frank's preferred pace. There was a pause in Frank's reply. Sandra told me. "Not a long one, but long enough." "That's straightforward," he had apparently written back. "More straightforward than we anticipated." Sandra had replied, "Owen is a straightforward person. He respects his father's wishes." In the weeks between the funeral and the transfer hearing, I kept going to work. Calloway Mechanical's operations kept running. Boyd Strickland, who knew about the restructuring, my father had briefed him, and Sandra had confirmed it in writing, ran the service bays and the maintenance contracts and the job dispatch with the steady unsentimentality of a man who understood that boilers don't stop needing service because the owner's estate is in proceedings. The crews knew a transition was happening. Business transitions after an owner's death are impossible to hide in a company of 90 people. But the paychecks cleared on schedule and the service calls went out on time, because the holding structure meant the business operations were entirely separate from the estate proceedings. Vivian had no idea any of this existed. I had one direct conversation with her during this period. It was a Sunday afternoon in late November, 3 weeks after the funeral. I was at a job site in Nisku reviewing a mechanical scope with the site super, and she called me. I stepped away from the trailer and stood in the cold with a set of drawings under my arm. "Owen." Her voice was the same as always, measured, warm in the calculated way. The hotel concierge turned up a degree. "I just want you to know I don't want this to be adversarial. Your father loved you. I know he did. I'd like us to be able to move through this with some grace." "I think that's a reasonable goal," I said. "Frank tells me Sandra has agreed to the transfer. That means a great deal to me, Owen. Truly. My father's will was clear. I'm not going to stand in the way of it." A silence. The kind where you can feel the other person recalibrating. "I think we can still be family," she said. "After all this." "Of course," I said. The sun had completely left the Nisku sky by the time she hung up, which in November, Alberta, means it was approximately 3:30 in the afternoon. The wind had a particular edge to it coming off the open fields east of the airport. I stood there for a moment with the cold on my face and the drawings under my arm and thought about what she had just said. Family. In 4 days, that word was going to cost her something she hadn't planned for. The transfer hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in December 2024 at the Edmonton Law Courts building on 103rd Avenue. Sandra had filed the paperwork for the voluntary transfer of Calloway Mechanical Services Limited shares, clean, uncontested, exactly as Frank had demanded. No objections, no counterfilings, no delay. I wore a charcoal jacket and dark trousers. My father would have called it dressed enough. I drove downtown and parked on 102nd Street and walked to the courthouse with my breath visible in the December air. Sandra was waiting in the corridor outside the hearing room. Beside her was a corporate documents associate named Lena Park, 36 years old, who had overseen the technical execution of the holding structure and who looked, when I was introduced to her, like someone who has already considered every possible outcome and found none of them surprising. Vivienne arrived with Frank Desrosiers at 9:20. She was composed, dressed sharply, ready in the way a person is ready when they expect to be confirmed in possession of something significant. Frank was a tall man in his early 60s, silver-haired, with the bearing of a senior partner who has been in enough rooms to know when he holds the better hand. He greeted Sandra with a professional nod and set his briefcase on the table. The presiding officer reviewed the filings. She confirmed the August 2024 will's validity. She confirmed that Owen Calloway had consented without opposition to the transfer of all Calloway Mechanical Services Limited shares to Vivienne Calloway. She asked Sandra directly whether her client had any objections to the transfer as documented. Sandra said none. Mr. Calloway is in full agreement. Vivienne shifted in her chair. Not much, just a slight resettlement of a person who came expecting turbulence and has found so far open sky. Frank's shoulders dropped approximately half an inch. The transfer was approved. The order was signed. And at that point, as required by the procedural documentation accompanying an estate asset transfer in Alberta, Frank reached for the corporate schedule, the supporting document itemizing the current asset composition of Calloway Mechanical Services Limited as of the date of transfer. He opened the folder. He read the first page. He turned to the second page and stopped. I watched his face change the way a load-bearing wall changes when something shifts in the foundation. Not immediately, not all at once, but progressively, as the information moved from his eyes to his brain, and his brain refused for a moment to accept the arithmetic. He looked up at Sandra. Sandra looked back at him the way a person looks when they already know every word in the document and have known for months. Frank looked back down. He found the line, the specific sentence that described the net asset value of Calloway Mechanical Services Limited. As of October 31, 2023, following the completion of the restructuring into the Leonard Calloway Family Trust and Associated Holding Company. Net asset value. The room was quiet for about 5 seconds. In administrative proceedings, 5 seconds is a geologic era. Frank set the document down with the deliberate care of a man who has decided, consciously, to keep his hands from doing anything that might be observed. He removed his reading glasses. He placed them on the table beside the document with a precision that had nothing to do with the glasses and everything to do with buying himself 3 seconds to think. He looked at Sandra with an expression that was working very hard to remain neutral and was losing that effort by small visible degrees. "Counsel," he said, "I'd like to request a brief recess." It was granted. Vivienne leaned toward Frank immediately, her voice low, her composure doing what composure does when it's working against significant pressure. "What does it say? What's happening?" Frank put his hand lightly on her forearm. "Sandra, not here." They moved into the corridor. I remained at the table. Sandra poured herself a glass of water from the pitcher on the table and slid one across to me without being asked. "How are you holding up?" she said quietly. "I'm all right," I said, and I meant it, which surprised me a little. Through the glass panel in the corridor door, I could see Vivienne's face as Frank showed her the document. I watched her read it. I watched her head come up. The composed window that she had worn since the funeral, through the registered letter, through the texts, through the phone call about moving through things with grace, through all of it, came apart in stages. Confusion, then a specific kind of disbelief that looks almost like concentration, then the jaw-set fury of a person who has just understood that they have been outmaneuvered by someone they had written off as cooperative. She pushed back through the door before Frank could reach the handle. "What did you do?" She was looking at me. Her voice was controlled, barely. "What did you do to that company?" "I didn't do anything to it," I said. "My father restructured it 14 months ago. I'm just the one who showed up. That's fraudulent. He stripped the estate assets. He can't do that," Sandra said, calmly and without any particular emphasis. "Mr. Calloway restructured his business holdings, which is a right available to any business owner under Alberta's Business Corporations Act. The restructuring was completed in October 2023 and is fully documented with a clear and auditable business rationale. The will your client is relying on was executed in August 2024, after the restructuring had been complete for nearly a year. Mr. Calloway was entirely within his legal rights. He did this to cut me out." His voice had risen. "He did this to protect his business. Whether you see those as the same thing is a question of perspective." Frank had come back in, and had placed himself beside Vivienne with the practiced efficiency of a lawyer managing a client who is about to say something that will be noted in the record. The presiding officer returned. The proceedings resumed. The transfer of Calloway Mechanical Services Limited, the dormant shell, the entity, the corporate filing with no operations and no assets, was formally completed. Vivienne Calloway received exactly what the August 2024 will had specified. She inherited the name of a company that no longer contained a company. I didn't feel triumphant. I want to be honest about that. What I felt was tired and sad, and something that was almost relief. The way you feel relief when a structure you have been watching for a long time finally settles into the position it was always going to find. My father had set the table. I had just made sure I didn't knock anything over on the way in. Sandra walked with me to the parkade on 102nd Street afterward. The December cold was serious by then, the kind that makes your eyes water and your breath come out in clouds. She said, "Frank will file for spousal entitlement under Alberta's Matrimonial Property Act within 30 days. He'll argue the restructuring was a fraudulent disposition made to defeat Vivienne's property rights. Can he make that case? He can file it. Making it stick is harder. The restructuring is documented, the business rationale is clear, and under Alberta law, the court has to consider the fair market value of assets transferred within 2 years, but it also has to weigh the documented intent and the business reasons. We have your father's records. We have what he compiled before he came to see me. The paper trail is clean. What does she realistically end up with? The Glenora house, which is paid off. Current market value somewhere around $850,000. The personal accounts, which total approximately $340,000 after estate costs. A potential claim on a portion of the marital component of business goodwill, which will argue down significantly given the circumstances. She's not destitute. She ends up comfortable. She just doesn't end up with 90 people's livelihoods. My father said something similar to you when he came in that September." She nodded, almost word for word. I thought about that on the drive home. He had been watching the same thing I had been watching. He had been watching longer. He had just chosen a different response. Quieter, more methodical, more certain. He had done what he always did. He had looked at the structure, identified the load-bearing elements, and built the support before the weight arrived. Frank filed the matrimonial property claim 22 days later. The litigation was real. Months of document production, financial examinations, an independent business valuator engaged by both sides. Vivienne's legal team went through the company records looking for grounds to challenge the restructuring. They found something they weren't looking for. The same vendor that had appeared in the accounts payable ledger in 2021, the one with invoices that ran 30% above quote, the one with fuel card charges at locations that matched no active job site, the forensic accounting review, ordered by the court as part of the matrimonial property valuation process, identified a pattern across 19 months of company records. Inflated invoices from a sole proprietorship with a registered Alberta address that turned out to be a mail forwarding service. Payments traced through that proprietorship to a personal account with Vivienne Calloway as sole signatory. $288,000 over 19 months. Sandra did not use it as leverage in a backroom conversation. She filed it with the court as part of the matrimonial property proceeding, as relevant financial history directly affecting the marital asset calculation, specifically as a reduction to the estate value attributable to transfers the court might characterize as misappropriation. Frank Desrosiers withdrew from the file 16 days later. His withdrawal cited a conflict of interest, which is what lawyers write when they mean I am not going to be standing at counsel table when this becomes a criminal matter. Vivienne retained a new lawyer, a woman named Carol Abernathy, from a smaller firm in Sherwood Park. Carol was sharp and she assessed the situation quickly. She called Sandra within 2 weeks. Vivienne would drop the matrimonial property claim in full. She would accept the Glenora house and the personal accounts. She would sign a complete release of any interest in the holding company, the trust, and the operations of Calloway Mechanical Services Limited. In exchange, the misappropriation documentation would be treated as settled within the civil proceedings and would not be forwarded to the Edmonton Police Service or the CRA. Sandra brought it to me on a Thursday evening. We sat in her office with the city lights coming on across the North Saskatchewan Valley and the river somewhere below us, invisible but present. She walked me through it. She walks away with substantial assets. You walk away with the company intact and without a referral process that could take 2 or more years. Your father restructured the business to protect it, not to punish her. He was right, I said, and I knew it. I signed the settlement on a Monday morning in March 2025, 22 weeks after my father's funeral, 13 weeks after a lawyer in a downtown Edmonton hearing room had opened a corporate asset schedule and spent 5 seconds understanding that everything he had assumed walking into that room was incorrect. I drove out to a commercial project in Leduc County that Boyd had been managing through the whole of it, an industrial refrigeration installation for a food processing facility, the kind of contract my father had spent 30 years building the reputation to land. The steel was up and the mechanical rough-in was running on schedule. I parked and walked the perimeter. The crew was working, the equipment was moving. The cold was doing what Alberta cold does in March, easing just slightly, not enough to call it spring, but enough that you can tell the balance has shifted. I got Boyd on the radio. "How's the refrigeration scope tracking?" he said. "Right where it needs to be. Compressor room is roughed in. We're on schedule." "Good," I said. "Keep it rolling." I stood there for a while in the March light, listening to the machinery in the radios, and the sound of something being built out of raw components and skilled hands. My father had stood on 100 sites like this one, in work boots and Wranglers, in every season Alberta produces, watching something go from nothing to something permanent. The sound was the same across all of it, the sound of a thing that was going to last longer than the people who built it. I didn't need it to feel like a conclusion. It already was one. There's something I want to say before I finish, because this channel is about more than the events. It's about what the events mean when you've had enough distance to see them clearly. My father was 72 years old, in the final year of his life, managing a recovery from a stroke, moving more slowly, carrying the kind of tiredness that accumulates in a person who has worked hard for 5 decades without ever fully stopping. He still had the clarity to document, to restructure, to consult his lawyer, and to protect a business that 90 people depended on for their livelihoods. He didn't do it from rage. He didn't do it for revenge. He did it because he was a builder, and builders think past themselves. They think about what happens to the structure after they are no longer the one holding it up. I spent years being carefully neutral, careful not to create conflict in my father's marriage, careful to be the cooperative adult son who didn't make things difficult or complicated. I understand that instinct. I still believe it came from the right place. But that careful neutrality had also allowed a situation to develop, financially, structurally, quietly, that required someone else to repair. My father repaired it. He did it on his own timeline, in his own methodical way without telling me until the work was already done. The lesson I carry from all of this is not that you should assume the worst about the people who come into your family's life. Most of them are not running a 19-month billing scheme. Most of them are just people. The lesson is simpler than that and older. Love and due diligence are not opposites. You can care deeply about someone and still know exactly what the legal documents say. You can be loyal to a relationship and still understand the corporate structure it's connected to. You can grieve a person and still honor what they built by making sure it survives them. My father knew all of this. He acted on it. And he left me something real to work with. The company is operating. The maintenance contracts are running. The crews are working. The service calls are going out every morning and coming back completed every evening. And every Friday morning, when I can manage it, I drive down to Donna's on 50th Street and I sit at the table by the window. I order 2 eggs over easy, rye toast, black tea. I read the paper, the print version. It's not efficiency, it's not habit. It's just the way certain things deserve to be done.